The fluorescent lights of the McDonald's cast an unforgiving glow across Marcus Thompson's reflection in the restaurant window. At 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night in March, the former Denver Broncos linebacker sat alone in a corner booth, methodically working his way through his third Big Mac of the evening. The wrapper crinkled as he unwrapped yet another burger, the sound echoing in the nearly empty restaurant like a prayer of surrender to his own destruction. 3 years had passed since Marcus last stepped foot on an NFL field, but the memory of that final game haunted him with crystalline clarity. The stadium lights had blazed overhead as he walked off the field for the last time. His career ended not by age or performance decline, but by a series of concussions that left doctors shaking their heads and lawyers drafting settlement papers. At 29, when most linebackers were entering their prime years, Marcus Thompson's football career was over. The man staring back at him from the window bore little resemblance to The Wall, the nickname that had defined him throughout his 8-year professional career. That Marcus had been 6'4" and 285 pounds of sculpted muscle, a force of nature who could read offensive formations like sheet music and deliver hits that echoed throughout stadiums from Denver to Miami. This Marcus, the one sitting in McDonald's at nearly 3 a.m., carried 347 pounds of regret, loneliness, and processed food on his frame. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Like most personal catastrophes, it had been a gradual slide that began innocuously enough. During his playing days, Marcus had maintained the disciplined lifestyle of a professional athlete, carefully calibrated meals prepared by team nutritionists, twice daily workouts that pushed his body to its limits, and a social calendar structured around team obligations and charitable appearances. But retirement had arrived like a demolition ball, destroying not just his career, but the entire framework that had given his life meaning and structure. The team facilities he'd visited daily for 8 years were suddenly off-limits. The nutritionists, trainers, and medical staff who had monitored every aspect of his physical condition moved on to other players. The teammates who had been like brothers during the season scattered to their own post-football pursuits, leaving Marcus alone in his suburban Denver mansion with nothing but time and an increasingly empty sense of purpose. The first few months hadn't been terrible. Marcus had savings, endorsement deals that continued to pay dividends, and speaking engagements that kept him busy enough to avoid confronting the growing void in his life. He'd told himself he was taking a well-deserved break, finally able to eat whatever he wanted after years of strict dietary control. A burger here, a pizza there. What harm could it do? But as the speaking engagements became less frequent and the endorsement deals failed to renew, Marcus found himself with vast stretches of unstructured time and a bank account that, while substantial, couldn't last forever without careful management. The careful management part proved to be beyond his capabilities. Financial planning had been handled by agents and advisors during his playing career, and without their guidance, Marcus made a series of investments that ranged from questionable to disastrous. The real estate venture that promised guaranteed returns turned out to be a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. The restaurant franchise he'd invested in failed within 18 months, taking a substantial portion of his savings with it. The sure thing stock tips from former teammates who claimed to have inside information proved to be anything but sure. Within 2 years of retirement, Marcus's financial situation had gone from comfortable to precarious. As his money dwindled, so did his social circle. The friends who had surrounded him during his glory days, many of whom had been attracted more to his status and spending power than to his personality, began to distance themselves. Invitations to parties and events became rare, then stopped altogether. The charitable organizations that had once competed for his time and attention moved on to current players who could generate more media coverage and donations. It was during this period of increasing isolation that food became Marcus's primary companion. What had started as occasional indulgences evolved into a comprehensive strategy for emotional numbing. The drive-through windows of Denver's fast food establishments became as familiar to him as the locker rooms and meeting rooms of NFL facilities had once been. His daily routine developed its own perverse structure. He'd wake up around noon, usually hungover from the previous night's combination of beer and self-pity, and begin the day with what he euphemistically called breakfast, typically a trip to Dunkin' Donuts for coffee and whatever pastries caught his eye. The sugar rush would carry him through the early afternoon, when lunch meant a visit to Taco Bell, KFC, or one of the sandwich shops that specialized in portions large enough to feed a construction crew. Dinner was the main event, a rotating selection of burger joints, pizza places, and Chinese restaurants that delivered until late in the evening. Marcus had become a regular customer at so many establishments that the staff knew his order by heart. The young woman at the McDonald's drive-thru would see his BMW pulling up and begin preparing his usual order before he even reached the speaker: 2 Big Macs, large fries, chicken nuggets, and whatever limited-time specialty burger was being promoted that month. But it wasn't just the quantity of food that defined his new lifestyle. It was the way eating had become his primary emotional outlet. Happy moments, which were increasingly rare, were celebrated with food. Stressful situations, which were becoming more common as his financial problems mounted, were medicated with food. Boredom, loneliness, anxiety, and depression were all treated with the same prescription: whatever could be delivered to his door or obtained through a drive-through window. The physical changes were dramatic and undeniable. Within 6 months of retirement, Marcus had gained 30 pounds. By the end of his first year away from football, he'd added 60 pounds to his playing weight. The custom-tailored suits that had made him look sophisticated at charity galas and press conferences no longer fit. The athletic clothing that had once showcased his physique now strained against his expanding frame. More troubling than the weight gain were the health problems that began to manifest. Marcus had always prided himself on his cardiovascular fitness. Linebackers needed to be able to sprint from sideline to sideline repeatedly throughout a game, and his conditioning had been legendary even among professional athletes. But now climbing a single flight of stairs left him winded. Walking from his car to a restaurant entrance required a brief rest to catch his breath. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by snoring that was so severe he'd wake himself up gasping for air. His joints, which had endured countless hits during his playing career, now ached constantly under the additional weight they were forced to support. Simple tasks like tying his shoes or getting out of a low chair became challenging endeavors that left him frustrated and embarrassed. The psychological effects were even more devastating than the physical ones. Marcus had built his entire identity around being an elite athlete, someone whose body was a finely tuned instrument capable of extraordinary feats. Watching that body deteriorate was like witnessing the destruction of everything he'd ever been proud of. The mirror became his enemy, reflecting back a stranger who bore little resemblance to the man he remembered being. Depression settled over him like a heavy blanket. Days would pass when he didn't leave his house, except to obtain food. He stopped answering phone calls from family members and the few friends who still tried to maintain contact. When former teammates reached out, Marcus would deflect with humor or outright lies about how well he was doing, creating an elaborate fiction of post-football success that bore no resemblance to reality. The lies became easier to maintain because he rarely saw anyone in person. Food delivery apps had made it possible to sustain his lifestyle without meaningful human interaction. He could order meals from multiple restaurants in a single day, having breakfast delivered from one place, lunch from another, and dinner from a third, all without speaking to another human being beyond the brief interaction required to receive his order. His apartment, which had once been meticulously maintained, began to reflect his internal state of chaos. Pizza boxes stacked up in precarious towers on his coffee table. Empty soda cans and food containers created a landscape of waste that he periodically cleared away in fits of shame, only to recreate within days. The kitchen, which he'd rarely used even during his healthiest periods, became a storage area for takeout containers and delivery bags. The turning point came on an unremarkable Tuesday morning in March, exactly 3 years after his retirement from professional football. Marcus had spent the previous evening in his usual routine: Chinese takeout, followed by ice cream, washed down with beer while scrolling through social media posts from former teammates who seemed to be thriving in their post-football lives. The contrast between their apparent success and his obvious decline was a source of constant torment, yet he couldn't stop himself from seeking out these reminders of what his life might have been. He'd gone to bed around 3 a.m., His stomach distended from the massive quantities of food he'd consumed, and woken up 6 hours later, feeling worse than usual. There was a tightness in his chest that he initially attributed to indigestion, a common occurrence given his dietary habits. But as he shuffled to the kitchen to begin his day with leftover lo mein and a Mountain Dew, the sensation intensified. The pain started as a dull ache beneath his sternum, then spread outward like ripples on a pond. His left arm began to tingle, and suddenly Marcus found himself struggling to breathe. The realization that he might be having a heart attack hit him with the same force as the blindside tackle that had ended his career, unexpected, devastating, and impossible to ignore. The next few minutes passed in a blur of panic and clarity. Marcus managed to call 911, though his voice was barely a whisper as he gave his address to the dispatcher. He unlocked his front door and then collapsed onto his living room floor, surrounded by the detritus of his self-destructive lifestyle, waiting for help to arrive. The paramedics who responded to the call were a study in professional competence. The lead EMT, a woman in her 30s with calm eyes and steady hands, immediately began assessing Marcus's condition while her partner prepared equipment. As they worked, she spoke to him in a tone that was simultaneously authoritative and reassuring. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" she asked, attaching electrodes to his chest. "Marcus Thompson," he managed to whisper. "Okay, Marcus, I'm Sarah, and this is my partner Jim. We're going to take good care of you. Can you describe the pain you're experiencing?" As Marcus tried to explain the crushing sensation in his chest, Sarah was already interpreting the readouts from the portable EKG machine. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but Marcus caught a glimpse of concern in her eyes that told him everything he needed to know about the severity of his condition. The ride to the hospital was a surreal experience that felt both eternal and instantaneous. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness as the ambulance navigated Denver's morning traffic, its sirens clearing a path through the urban maze. Sarah continued to monitor his vital signs while communicating with the hospital's emergency department, her voice a steady stream of medical terminology that sounded like a foreign language to Marcus, but apparently conveyed crucial information about his condition. Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital's emergency department was a controlled chaos of medical professionals responding to Marcus's arrival. He was transferred from the ambulance gurney to a hospital bed with practiced efficiency, and within minutes he was surrounded by doctors and nurses who moved with the same kind of coordinated precision he remembered from NFL game plans. Dr. Rachel Chen, the cardiologist who took charge of Marcus's case, was a petite woman whose diminutive stature belied the authority she commanded in the cardiac unit. After reviewing his test results and consulting with the emergency department physicians, she pulled up a chair beside his bed for a conversation that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. "Mr. Thompson, you've suffered what we call a myocardial infarction, a heart attack," she began, her tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "The good news is that we were able to restore blood flow to your heart relatively quickly, which minimized the damage to your cardiac muscle. The less good news is that your cardiovascular system is under tremendous stress, and without significant changes to your lifestyle, we're going to be having this conversation again in the not-too-distant future." Dr. Chen pulled up Marcus's test results on a tablet, showing him images and numbers that painted a comprehensive picture of his declining health. His cholesterol levels were dangerously elevated, his blood pressure was in the hypertensive range, and his blood sugar indicated the early stages of diabetes. At 32 years old, he had the cardiovascular profile of a sedentary man twice his age. "What kind of changes are we talking about?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Everything," Dr. Chen replied without hesitation. "Diet, exercise, sleep patterns, stress management. Basically, you need to rebuild your entire approach to living. I know that sounds overwhelming, but I've seen people make these kinds of transformations before. The question is whether you're ready to commit to the work it's going to require." As Marcus lay in his hospital bed over the next 3 days, undergoing a battery of tests and consultations with various specialists, he had more time to think than he'd allowed himself in years. The constant stream of food deliveries and mindless entertainment that had filled his days was replaced by the enforced stillness of medical recovery, creating space for reflection that was both uncomfortable and necessary. The parade of visitors during his hospitalization told the story of how isolated his life had become. His parents drove up from Colorado Springs, their faces showing a mixture of relief that he was alive and concern about the lifestyle choices that had brought him to this point. A few former teammates sent flowers and get-well cards, though none visited in person. The absence of close friends or romantic relationships was a stark reminder of how thoroughly he'd sabotaged his personal connections. But it was a conversation with Maria Santos, one of the nurses who cared for him during his stay, that provided the spark for what would become his transformation. Maria had worked in cardiac care for over a decade, and she'd seen countless patients struggle with the lifestyle changes necessary for heart health recovery. "The hardest part isn't the diet or the exercise," she told Marcus as she checked his vital signs on his final day in the hospital. "It's figuring out who you are when you can't be who you used to be." Most of our patients who succeed in making lasting changes find something new to be passionate about, something that gives them a reason to take care of themselves beyond just avoiding another heart attack. Her words echoed in Marcus's mind as he was discharged with a thick folder of dietary guidelines, exercise recommendations, and follow-up appointment schedules. The cardiac rehabilitation program he'd been enrolled in would provide structure and medical supervision for his physical recovery, but Maria's insight about finding new passion resonated with him on a deeper level. The first few weeks of his transformation were a battle fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. The physical withdrawal from processed foods was unexpectedly intense, involving headaches, mood swings, and cravings that made him understand why addiction recovery was so challenging. His new diet, designed by a nutritionist who specialized in cardiac recovery, consisted primarily of lean proteins, vegetables, whole grains, and fruits, foods that tasted like cardboard after years of consuming hyperpalatable combinations of salt, sugar, and fat. Exercise was equally challenging, but for different reasons. The body that had once been capable of extraordinary athletic feats now struggled with basic movements. A 15-minute walk around his neighborhood left him exhausted and embarrassed, particularly when he encountered neighbors who remembered him from his playing days. The gap between his former physical capabilities and his current limitations was a daily reminder of how far he'd fallen. But as the weeks progressed, Marcus began to notice subtle improvements that kept him motivated to continue. His sleep quality improved dramatically once he eliminated late-night eating sessions. His energy levels, which had been consistently low for years, began to stabilize. Most surprisingly, his relationship with food began to change in ways that went beyond simple dietary modifications. During his playing career, Marcus had viewed food primarily as fuel, something to be consumed in precise quantities at specific times to optimize athletic performance. During his decline, food had become an emotional crutch, a way to temporarily escape from feelings of failure and disappointment. Now, as he slowly rebuilt his relationship with eating, food was becoming something different, a form of self-care, a way of demonstrating respect for his body and commitment to his recovery. The weight loss was gradual but consistent. 2 pounds the first week, 3 the second, then a steady rhythm of progress that Marcus tracked obsessively in a journal his cardiac rehabilitation counselor had recommended. But more important than the numbers on the scale were the functional improvements he began to notice. Climbing stairs without getting winded, bending over to tie his shoes without struggling for breath, catching a glimpse of his jawline in the mirror for the first time in years. 3 months into his recovery, Marcus experienced what he would later describe as an epiphany. He was volunteering at a local food bank, part of his effort to rebuild social connections and find meaningful ways to spend his time, when he witnessed a medical emergency that would change the course of his life. An elderly volunteer named Frank had been sorting canned goods when he suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. The other volunteers stood around in panic, unsure of what to do, while someone called 911. Marcus knelt beside Frank and, drawing on half-remembered first aid training from his football days, began talking to him calmly while checking for a pulse and monitoring his breathing. When the paramedics arrived, Marcus was able to provide them with detailed information about Frank's condition and the timeline of his collapse. The lead EMT, a veteran named Jake Rodriguez, was impressed by Marcus's composure and the quality of information he'd gathered. "You did good work here," Jake told Marcus as they loaded Frank into the ambulance. "Have you ever thought about emergency medical training? We could use people with your kind of instincts." The seed Jake planted that day grew quickly in Marcus's mind. Emergency medical services represented everything he'd been searching for since his retirement from football. Physical demands that would challenge his improving fitness, high-stakes decision-making that would engage his competitive instincts, and most importantly, work that would provide the sense of purpose and meaning that had been missing from his life. Within a week of the incident at the food bank, Marcus had enrolled in an EMT training program at the local community college. The decision surprised everyone who knew him, including Marcus himself. He'd never shown any interest in healthcare beyond his own athletic injuries, and the idea of returning to school at 32 felt daunting after years of intellectual stagnation. But as he threw himself into his studies with the same intensity he'd once brought to learning defensive schemes, Marcus discovered that his athletic background provided unexpected advantages in emergency medical training. The physical demands of EMT work, lifting patients, performing CPR for extended periods, working in cramped conditions, came naturally to someone who had spent years conditioning his body for peak performance. More importantly, the mental toughness required to make split-second decisions under pressure was a skill he'd honed during thousands of plays under stadium lights. The ability to remain calm in chaotic situations, to process multiple streams of information simultaneously, and to execute complex procedures while adrenaline coursed through his system. These were all transferable skills from his football career. His classmates were an eclectic mix of people from various backgrounds and stages of life. Recent high school graduates looking for career direction, career changers seeking more meaningful work, military veterans transitioning to civilian employment, and a few older students like Marcus who were rebuilding their lives from scratch. At first, Marcus was self-conscious about being the former NFL player in the room, worried that his past would overshadow his present efforts or that others would question his motivations. But as the weeks progressed, he found that his celebrity status, such as it was, became less relevant than his dedication to mastering the material. His study habits, developed during years of memorizing complex playbooks, served him well in learning anatomy, pharmacology, and emergency protocols. His natural leadership abilities, which had made him a team captain during his playing career, emerged in group training exercises and practical scenarios. The program was intensive, requiring evening classes 3 nights a week, plus weekend practicals that simulated real-world emergency situations. Marcus approached each component with the methodical preparation that had made him successful as a professional athlete. He created detailed study schedules, practiced procedures until they became second nature, and sought out additional training opportunities beyond the basic curriculum requirements. His transformation during this period was remarkable not just in terms of knowledge acquisition, but in the way it affected his overall health and well-being. The combination of rigorous study, practical training, and his ongoing fitness routine created a positive feedback loop that accelerated his recovery from years of self-destructive behavior. By the time Marcus took his EMT certification exam 6 months after enrolling in the program, he had lost over 90 pounds from his peak weight and gained something even more valuable, a clear sense of direction for the first time since his retirement from football. He passed the exam with one of the highest scores in his class, an achievement that filled him with a pride that rivaled any touchdown or tackle from his playing career. The difference was that this accomplishment felt more meaningful because it represented not just personal achievement, but preparation for a career dedicated to helping others in their most vulnerable moments. The skills he'd learned weren't for competing against opponents, but for fighting against death, injury, and suffering. His first day on the job with Denver Emergency Medical Services was a mixture of excitement and terror that reminded him of his NFL rookie season. Paired with veteran EMT Maria Santos, the same Maria who had cared for him during his hospitalization, Marcus found himself responding to calls throughout the city, each one a new lesson in the complexity of human crisis. Maria, it turned out, had specifically requested to be paired with Marcus for his initial weeks on the job. She'd followed his progress through the cardiac rehabilitation program and EMT training, and she was curious to see how the former athlete would adapt to the realities of emergency medical work. "Most people come into this job thinking they know what it's going to be like," she told Marcus as they began their first shift together. "But there's no way to really prepare for the emotional intensity of holding someone's life in your hands. The technical skills are important, but it's the psychological resilience that determines whether someone lasts in this field." Their first call was routine, a transport for an elderly woman who needed regular dialysis treatments but couldn't drive herself to the clinic. As Marcus helped load the patient into the ambulance, she looked up at him with grateful eyes and said, "Thank you, son. You're doing God's work." The simple phrase hit Marcus with unexpected force, providing a glimpse of the fulfillment that would come to define his new career. The calls that followed over the next few weeks ran the complete spectrum of human experience. Car accidents that ranged from minor fender benders to multi-vehicle collisions with life-threatening injuries. Heart attacks that mirrored his own experience, but from the perspective of the rescuer rather than the victim. Overdoses that revealed the devastating effects of addiction on individuals and families. Domestic violence situations that required delicate balance between medical care and personal safety. Each situation demanded different aspects of Marcus's training and personality. His size and physical presence were advantages when dealing with combative patients or challenging extraction scenarios. His calm demeanor under pressure, developed through years of high-stakes athletic competition, proved invaluable in crisis situations. But it was his genuine empathy for people in distress, an empathy that had been deepened by his own struggles with addiction and health problems, that made him particularly effective at connecting with patients and their families. One call that occurred during his second month on the job became a defining moment in Marcus's understanding of his new role. The address was a modest apartment complex in a middle-income neighborhood, and the initial report was vague. Possible cardiac event, male, approximately 30 years old. As Marcus and Maria climbed the stairs to the third floor, they could hear shouting from inside the apartment. They were greeted by a panicked woman in her late 20s, tears streaming down her face as she led them to the kitchen where her husband lay unconscious on the floor. The scene was disturbingly familiar to Marcus, a man roughly his own age surrounded by fast food containers and empty soda bottles, the victim of lifestyle choices that had culminated in a medical emergency. The patient's name was David, and his wife explained through her tears that he had been a college football player whose career had ended due to injury. Since then, he'd struggled with weight gain and depression, gaining over 100 pounds in 3 years, while refusing all attempts at intervention. The parallels to Marcus's own story were so precise that he felt like he was looking at an alternate version of himself, one where the heart attack had come too late for recovery. David's condition was critical, massive myocardial infarction with irregular heartbeat and dangerously low blood pressure. As Marcus worked to stabilize him for transport, he found himself talking to the unconscious patient in a way that surprised even him. "Stay with me, brother," he whispered, while monitoring David's heart rhythm. "I know exactly where you've been, and I'm here to tell you it doesn't have to end this way. I was sitting in the same place you are right now just a year ago, and look at me now. You can come back from this, but you've got to fight." Whether it was skill, luck, or something more transcendent, David survived the transport and the subsequent emergency surgery. Marcus visited him in the cardiac ICU several days later, finding him awake and surrounded by family members who had flown in from various parts of the country. When Marcus introduced himself as one of the EMTs who had responded to the emergency, David's wife broke down in tears of gratitude. "The doctor said if you hadn't gotten him here so quickly, if you hadn't kept him stable during the transport, he wouldn't have made it," she said, gripping Marcus's hand. "You gave us our husband and father back." Marcus spent over an hour talking with David about his own journey from fast food addiction to emergency medical service. He shared practical advice about cardiac rehabilitation, dietary changes, and the psychological challenges of rebuilding identity after a life-altering health crisis. When he left his contact information and offered to provide ongoing support during David's recovery, it marked the beginning of an informal mentorship that would become one of the most rewarding aspects of Marcus's new life. Word of Marcus's story began to spread through the EMS community and beyond. His unique background, former NFL player who had overcome his own health crisis to become a life-saving EMT, made him a compelling figure for local media outlets looking for inspiring human interest stories. Initially reluctant to share his personal struggles publicly, Marcus eventually realized that his experience could serve as powerful motivation for others facing similar challenges. His first major media appearance was on a Denver morning television show, and Marcus approached the interview with the same nervous energy he'd felt before important games during his playing career. But as he sat across from the friendly host and began recounting his journey from self-destruction to service, he found the words flowing with surprising ease. "I thought I had lost everything when my football career ended," he explained to the camera. "My identity, my purpose, my physical health, it all seemed to disappear at once. I used food to try to fill that void, and it nearly killed me. But sometimes hitting rock bottom becomes the foundation you need to build something better. The heart attack that almost ended my life actually saved it, because it forced me to confront who I really was beneath all the roles other people had created for me." The response to the interview was overwhelming and immediate. Marcus received hundreds of emails, phone calls, and social media messages from people sharing their own struggles with weight, addiction, depression, and identity crises following major life transitions. Many were former athletes dealing with similar challenges, but others were ordinary people who had simply lost their way and found inspiration in his story of transformation. One message that particularly moved him came from a woman named Jennifer, whose teenage son had been a promising high school football player before a knee injury ended his athletic career. The boy had fallen into severe depression and destructive eating habits, gaining over 60 pounds in 8 months, while refusing all attempts at intervention from family members and counselors. "He watched your interview 3 times, Jennifer wrote in her email. "For the first time in almost a year, he asked about getting help. He said if someone as successful as you could fall that far and still find a way back, maybe there was hope for him too. You gave him something I couldn't, proof that it's possible to completely rebuild your life, even when everything seems lost." Stories like Jennifer's motivated Marcus to become more intentional about sharing his message of recovery and transformation. He began accepting speaking engagements at high schools, community centers, addiction recovery programs, and medical conferences, always emphasizing that change was possible but never easy or guaranteed. His approach to public speaking was influenced by his EMT training and experience. He focused on providing practical, potentially life-saving information rather than generic inspirational platitudes. He talked about recognizing the warning signs of heart disease, the importance of seeking medical help before crisis struck, and specific strategies for breaking destructive eating patterns that had worked in his own recovery. Most importantly, he emphasized that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, but a demonstration of strength and wisdom. The message resonated particularly strongly with male audiences, who were statistically less likely to seek medical care or admit to struggling with mental health issues. As Marcus entered his second year as an EMT, he found himself taking on additional responsibilities within the department that reflected his natural leadership abilities and unique gift for connecting with patients in crisis. His supervisors recognized his talent for training new EMTs, and he was assigned to mentor recent graduates during their initial weeks on the job. Teaching others gave Marcus yet another source of purpose and fulfillment. He discovered that sharing his knowledge and experience with newcomers to the field created a positive cycle. The more he invested in developing other people's capabilities, the more satisfaction he derived from his own work. His training style was patient but demanding, emphasizing not just technical competence, but the emotional resilience required for long-term success in emergency medical services. The physical transformation that had begun with his heart attack was now complete and then some. At 215 pounds of lean muscle, Marcus looked more like his college-playing weight than he had in over a decade. But the real change was internal. The confidence that had once derived from athletic achievement now came from knowing that he was making a genuine difference in people's lives every single day. His personal relationships, which had suffered tremendously during his period of decline, began to heal and flourish as well. His parents, who had watched their son's deterioration with helpless concern, now spoke with pride about his new career and the positive impact he was having on his community. Former teammates who had lost touch during his dark period reached out to congratulate him and seek advice for their own post-football transitions. Even romantic relationships, which he'd avoided completely during his years of self-destruction, began to seem possible again. Marcus started dating Dr. Lisa Park, a pediatric emergency physician he'd met during a hospital transport, and for the first time in years he felt capable of being a partner rather than a burden in a relationship. The call that would ultimately define Marcus' legacy as an EMT came on a frigid February evening during his third year on the job. The emergency was at a 24-hour fitness center downtown. A young man had collapsed during a late-night workout, and witnesses reported that he'd been complaining of chest pain before losing consciousness. When Marcus and his partner arrived at the scene, they found 24-year-old Tyler Martinez, a competitive bodybuilder who had suffered cardiac arrest despite his apparent fitness and youth. Tyler had an undiagnosed congenital heart condition that had been exacerbated by performance-enhancing drug use, creating a perfect storm of cardiovascular risk factors that had culminated in complete cardiac arrest. Tyler was in full arrest when Marcus began CPR. No pulse, no breathing, no signs of life beyond the faint hope that rapid intervention might restore cardiac function. What followed was a resuscitation effort that lasted 53 minutes, far longer than most successful attempts and well beyond what many EMTs would have considered reasonable. Marcus performed chest compressions for the majority of that time, drawing on reserves of strength and endurance that surprised even his experienced partner. Multiple shocks with the defibrillator, several rounds of cardiac medications, advanced airway management, and continuous high-quality CPR finally restored Tyler's heartbeat just as they arrived at the hospital emergency department. The medical team that took over Tyler's care was initially skeptical that such a prolonged resuscitation effort could result in meaningful recovery. Patients who required CPR for nearly an hour typically suffered severe neurological damage even if their heart function was restored. But Tyler defied the odds, awakening after 3 days in intensive care with minimal cognitive impairment and full neurological function. When Tyler was finally able to speak coherently, one of his first questions was about the EMT who had performed CPR for so long. The hospital staff told him that most providers would have terminated resuscitation efforts after 20 or 30 minutes, but Marcus had refused to give up. "He saved my life through pure determination and skill," Tyler later told reporters who covered his remarkable recovery. "The doctors said if he had stopped compressions even 5 minutes earlier, I wouldn't have made it. I don't know what drove him to keep going when anyone else would have given up, but I'm grateful every day that he had that fight in him." What drove Marcus was the knowledge that every life was worth fighting for. The understanding that sometimes the difference between life and death came down to simple human persistence, and the memory of his own second chance that had transformed him from a man slowly killing himself into someone who saved lives for a living. Tyler's case became a teaching example in EMT training programs throughout Colorado and beyond, and Marcus was recognized with his department's highest honor for life-saving service. The recognition was gratifying, but for Marcus, the real reward came in the form of a letter from Tyler's mother 6 months after the incident. "You gave me my son back," she wrote. "I know you were just doing your job, but what you did that night went far beyond duty or training. You gave our family a future we thought we'd lost, and you did it through sheer refusal to give up on someone who seemed beyond help. Tyler is getting married next month, and we'll think of you during the ceremony, knowing that none of it would be happening if you hadn't fought so hard for his life." As Marcus approached his 4th year as an EMT, he began to reflect more deeply on the journey that had brought him from fast food addiction to life-saving service. The transformation had been about much more than losing weight or changing careers. It had been about discovering who he really was beneath the identities that others had created for him and that he had accepted without question. During his football career, he'd been the wall, defined entirely by his ability to stop opposing players and contribute to his team's success. In his period of decline, he'd become the cautionary tale, the former athlete who couldn't handle the transition to civilian life. Now he was simply Marcus, a man who had faced his demons, conquered his most destructive habits, and found a way to transform his personal struggle into a force for good in the world. The fast food restaurants he'd once frequented were still there, still serving the same addictive combinations of salt, sugar, and fat that had nearly killed him. But now, when he passed them during his shifts, Marcus felt something closer to compassion than disgust. He understood the seductive power of comfort food, the way it could temporarily mask deeper pain and emptiness, but he also knew that true comfort came from living with purpose, from knowing that your life had meaning beyond immediate gratification. His story had become part of the culture of Denver EMS, told to new recruits as an example of redemption and the power of second chances. But Marcus himself was less interested in being remembered as an inspiration than in being useful in the present moment. Every call he responded to, every life he touched, every person he helped transport to safety represented another small victory over the forces that had once controlled his own existence. The young man who had once found his identity in preventing touchdowns had discovered something far more meaningful: the ability to prevent tragedies. The body that had once been a weapon on the football field had become an instrument of healing and hope. And the appetite that had once threatened to destroy him had been transformed into a hunger for making a difference in the world. As Marcus finished his shift on that February evening walking through the hospital corridors he'd come to know so well, he paused at the window of the cardiac intensive care unit where his own transformation had begun 4 years earlier. The unit was quiet, most patients sleeping peacefully under the watchful eyes of nurses and monitors. Somewhere in the city, he knew, there were people making the same destructive choices he'd once made, using food to fill emotional voids, slowly poisoning themselves with substances marketed as comfort and pleasure. Some would face their own moments of reckoning, their own versions of the heart attack that had saved his life by nearly ending it. And when that happened, when the call came in for a cardiac emergency or overdose or any of the countless ways people found to harm themselves, Marcus would be there. He'd load them into his ambulance, monitor their vital signs, and fight to keep them alive long enough to reach the hospital where others could continue the battle. But more than that, he'd be living proof that transformation was possible, that anyone could rebuild their life from the foundation up, that destructive impulses could become constructive purpose. His presence would carry a message of hope. If a man who had once eaten himself into a heart attack could become someone who saves lives for a living, then anyone could change. The fast food might have nearly killed him, but in the end, it had led him to discover his true calling. Marcus Thompson, former NFL linebacker, former fast food addict, current EMT and lifesaver, finally knew who he was supposed to be. And every day as he strapped on his equipment and prepared to respond to whatever emergencies awaited, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most meaningful victories come not from preventing the other team from scoring, but from preventing life itself from ending too soon. His story was far from over, but the chapter of destruction and despair was definitively closed. The man who had once been known for stopping running backs was now known for stopping death itself, one emergency call at a time. In that transformation, Marcus had found something more valuable than any trophy or championship ring: purpose, redemption, and his way back to life.